Hello there, and welcome to Lesson 6 on this series on Game Maker Studio 2, created for the students at Saturday Academy. My name is Will Patillo. I'm the instructor for this course. And this lesson is going to be on having these enemies be able to shoot projectiles in various directions based on how they are facing. Since we've dealt a little bit with facing before, this should be relatively straightforward. So first, I'm going to need a projectile that the enemies can shoot, and I'm going to create this in the enemies group. So right-click, create sprite, and SPR projectile. Okay, open that up, and then let's edit the image, and I'll just create a circle. I'm going to make it just black, kind of a little bit bullet-like, and there it is, roughly centered. Next, go back up to the sprite level and check its collision mask. Now, for this, it's we don't want it to cover the whole thing. I'm going to set this to precise. If the collision mask is bigger than the perceived object, then the player will sometimes get hit when it looks like the projectile just passed by. And then they'll think the game's unfair and they won't like it. So yeah, make sure to set the collision mask like that. And now we'll create an object on which we can apply the sprite. So obj projectile. And let's put it with the enemy here. And set its sprite to that projectile sprite that we just created. Okay. Next, this enemy is going to need to sometimes create these projectiles. Now, when is that going to happen? Well, I think I'd put this on its decision. So on this alarm 0, this is whenever the enemy makes a decision, and currently they're just picking some random direction to move. Instead of that, we want there to be some chance that they move and some chance that they instead stop and shoot the projectile, or just continue moving the way that they're going. Instead of simply choosing a direction, I'm going to have another bit of randomization here. And I'd like there to be a percentage chance that the enemy either fires or moves at random. So so the simple choose works great if you want there to be an equal chance of each of the options, but this is not necessarily the case. I might want a 80% chance of moving, 20% chance of firing, or 70-30, or 60-40, or anywhere in there. So for that, I'm going to use this get a random number. This gets a random inclusive number, and just to make it intuitive, I'm going to make it between 0 and 100. And I'm just going to call this choice. Okay, and set this to temp because only this event is going to need it. And so this is going to pick a random number between 0 and 100 inclusive and store that inside of choice. And now we're going to make a decision based on this choice value. So I'm going to take this if variable action, and so if this choice is less than 60, so that means there's a 60% chance that we're going to move in some random direction. So I'll just move these actions over here. Okay. So if this happens, then all 3 of these actions will occur. And then otherwise, so else, that's our otherwise, then we're going to shoot. So to shoot, we'll need to create a projectile, so that's our create instance, and of type enemies projectile, and start it at 0, 0. And then we'll assign that projectile's direction to the facing value of this enemy, which remember we've specified in create now and gets changed every time movement is called. So we already know what direction the enemy is facing. So I could, setting the direction, use one of the direction variables. We want this to apply to the projectile, and right now, again, this is in the enemy script, so that's going to be a little bit awkward. Instead, I'm just going to use this more generic variable, and assign a variable, and the variable we're going to assign is the direction, but it's of the new projectile. Oh, and sorry about that. Actually, this doesn't mean anything just now because we need to actually have new projectile right here. So this is kind of like what we did with that sword in the last video, where we create the instance and we store that inside of new something. So in this case, new projectile. Now we have access to that specific instance of a projectile, and now we say this new projectile and then say dot direction, the direction of the new projectile, and we set that to facing, and that is the facing of the enemy. So I think that should be all we need. Actually, I think I'll make this 70-30 split, so it's a little bit more likely that they will just move. And then also one other thing, so we don't get tons of projectiles in the scene, I'm going to have this destroy itself after a while. So again, it's the same as with the sword. On create, we set an alarm. And this one, I'll give it a full second. And then say what happens when that alarm is completes its countdown, and that's simple enough. We simply have the projectile destroy itself. So now let's move around and see what happens. Okay, there is an error. Local variables facing not set before reading it. Oh, right. So the error right here is we should not tick this temp box. That makes this a local variable that just exists, in this case actually just for the duration of this little if statement right here. But we actually want to hold on to this and store it as part of the enemy. So yeah. So we have this object-wide variable, object-scoped variable that we have in this create event, and in this line right here we're setting that. Temp just means it only lives here. So untick that relative box, and let's see if that error goes away. Okay, so now, all right, their enemies are periodically creating projectiles, and that is good. They're kind of offset from where the enemies are, and they're also not moving. So let's fix that right now. So first of all, as to when you ever see things offset like that, often it's because the some anchor point on a sprite is not set correctly. So let's see, my enemy sprite is in the middle center, but my projectile is in the top left. So I'm going to put that in the middle center. And then, oh yes, for the speed, we could that's because we've set its direction, but we haven't set its speed. Now we could right here assign variable new projectile.speed, but I think it would be a little cleaner if just in our create event for the projectile, we just have it set its own speed right here. So set its own speed, and I'll say 5 on create. Okay, and now the enemies are moving, and they periodically fire off a projectile in the direction that they're facing. So let's watch this one. Yes, it fires forward. Great. I would say this works. Just one other little tweak I'd like to make is just shrink down this projectile a little. So go into the sprite, change its size, and let's see what it looks like at 32 by 32. And apply. Okay, and now those projectiles are firing. All right, so one last thing before I wrap this little tutorial up is right now the projectiles are just flying along and they're going right through walls, go right through the player. And I want them to stop and to disappear once they hit something. It's just to make it look a little bit more realistic. So the regular kind of collision detection that we've used before of having a step event and then checking for a collider base isn't quite going to work exactly like this. And we also don't need to jump back. We'll be using a different action here. So instead I'm going to use a slightly different process, and I'm going to have an add event and look for a collision with object collider base. Now if there's a collision, this could be with anything. This could be with the player. It could be with anything that inherits from collider base. Now one possible problem is that if it collides with an enemy, and this is definitely a problem because the object enemy inherits from collider base, and the projectile is created inside the enemy, so it's always going to collide with it. So we need to ignore this collision if the projectile is touching an enemy. So I'll go with this if object at place. So when there's a collision, if there is a enemy at 0, 0 relative, so that is if there's an enemy right where this projectile is, and or more specifically, if there is not an enemy right where this projectile is, then we'll destroy itself, and itself being the projectile. I mean, we could untick this and exit early and then have the destroy afterwards, but we only want to execute this if this condition of there being an object enemy right here is not true. So I'm going to run this, and also just so that I can see the effect a little better, I'm going to make the range a little further by making it take longer before the projectiles disappear. Now go around and enemies creating projectiles, and notice that one, just came out and it disappeared right away. Actually, I'm going to expand my room a little bit and put some enemies over here. So actually, to place them quickly, I can just hold Alt and click multiple times. And I'll move over to the edge wall over here so I can see the projectiles get destroyed by that wall. So yeah, you saw that one just disappeared against that wall. If I can get one to see me, yeah, that one just hit me in the head, and yes, the projectiles are disappearing, and while I can destroy the enemies with my sword. That is all for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.